When I'm writing my introduction to a guest, I keep thinking, oh, if only I could say that. Well, today I can, because my renowned guest on the BV-TV WebShow is not shy at pointing out challenges and problems, especially about leadership. He's the author of the book, The Decline of America, 100 Years of Leadership Failures. He helps resolve disputes. He helps solve management problems. He lives in Houston. Oh, the introduction just falls into my lap. Houston, we have a problem. Let's go solve it with Dr. David Schein. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much, Malcolm, for that wonderful introduction. And I would say it's not just Houston that has the problem, but America has the problem. And Houston's is a great shining example of both the positives and negatives.
Right. Well, I'm so looking forward to hearing from you. Look, this Dr. David Schein BV-TV WebShow is in 3 parts. In part 3, it will help us all see how we can learn from the past to correct our journey in the next 100 years, if we're around, how as leader we should be or become. In part 2, he reveals the thinking behind his podcast, Saving America, its aims and its calls to action. But we get straight to the heart of it all in part 1, as he talks about his book, The Decline of America, 100 Years of Leadership Failures. David, it's all yours. What's the book about?
Okay. We talk about leadership from 3 different perspectives, and I apply the same test to each of the 17 American presidents in the 100-year period that's covered by the book. So we start with Woodrow Wilson and we end with Barack Obama. The book was actually completed in 2017, and Obama left obviously in January 2017. We did add a little epilogue that acknowledges the crazy election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And so the focus is on the success of the leader, the ethics of the leader, and I divided ethics into 2 separate areas. One is, was the person themselves an ethical person? Because I think that's important. The guts of the person, how do they see life? Do they treat people well? And then the opposite one is, outside, how did they handle their public ethics? And we've got, quite extremes. We've got people who, generally speaking, passed the ethics trail quite well. Jimmy Carter, most people consider him very ethical internally and both externally, but not a very good leader. In contrast, Bill Clinton, I don't consider the great leader that some people do, but completely devoid of both personal and public ethics, and but had a pretty good run of 8 years. And I call him the luckiest of the 17 American presidents that I talk about. And so some of the things that I looked for is, number one, the highest rated president with a B-. By the way, the highest rated president was Harry Truman. And Truman, I like the fact that he was an honest person and he was his own person. Believe it or not, the only person not to hold a bachelor's degree, at least, before entering the White House. Although in doing further research, Truman was actually cleared to take the bar exam, never actually took the bar exam, but had actually sat for had actually qualified to sit for the bar exam. So he's certainly an educated person, but was not the most educated. Of course, Woodrow Wilson held a PhD and was a college professor at one point. So we go from one extreme to the other. From a bookend standpoint, it's roughly 100 years. It's actually 104 years, but as we say, who's counting? Yeah. And so I look at communication. And you've got Ronald Reagan, known as the great communicator, and he was. A lot of flaws. The national debt went up at a time when it probably shouldn't have. There were some scandals that probably should not have happened under a better administration, but generally had a pretty good run. In terms of inspiration, I would say a good leader is an inspiring leader. I would look at JFK and the trip to the moon, which unfortunately he did not live to see. but he didn't have a particularly good presidency. You know, the Bay of Pigs happened under his administration, which is why he doesn't get a great grade from me. But setting America on the path to the moon, which was actually accomplished, was significant and inspiring for the American people. And of course, it led to a lot of technological advances that we all benefit from today, including our amazing cell phones. Another inspiring leader was obviously Ronald Reagan, when he went to, West Germany and said, tear this wall down. And of course, that was accomplished later in the 80s. But so some great aspects to the situation. In terms of ethics, as I just mentioned, you've got a couple people who are utter failures. The only F in the book is Richard Nixon, who was forced to resign due to ethical problems. And interestingly, he did not orchestrate anything that happened. It's just that he had a failed loyalty to the idiots who broke into the Watergate. And the fascinating thing about the break-in at the Watergate, just saying as a sidelight, is Nixon was crushing the election. So to go in and do something that stupid, especially when you're so far ahead, made so incredibly little sense. He should have put them all out on the street and said, look, I don't have anything to do with these morons and all that. And of course, the punchline to that, as you know, I've done some radio in past years, is G. Gordon Liddy, who was involved in the mess, ends up with a radio show later. And apparently it's a fairly successful AM radio show for a while, but certainly not good. I've already mentioned Clinton was definitely a problem with regard to ethics. And we're still finding out more about I had to shorten the chapter on Clinton. I couldn't cover all of the ethical breaches because there were so many of them in just an 8-year period. And in terms of what you see, what you get, part of it is that not all of us have wonderful backgrounds. Not all of us were saints from the day one to the day last. And I give credit to George W. Bush, who did a good job with 9/11, did a rather poor job after that as president. But one of the interesting things is he admits to being an alcoholic and a party boy, but says, look, I got my life together and I have performed well. I've been a loyal husband to my wife and things like that. So I give George W. credit as a person. Like I said, unfortunately, not so great in some other aspects. And I also think a good leader is their own person. And I would contrast again the great Harry Truman, who truly was his own person, for better or for worse. You got what you got when you saw Harry Truman. He didn't filter himself. He didn't separate himself from the media. And in contrast to the failed administration of Barack Obama, who was essentially led by the nose by George Soros and some left-wing interests, and never really established who Barack Obama was as a leader. And I think it's unfortunate because where we had our first African-American president, that it would have been nice if it had been a successful administration. And I think that the difference is that instead of going his own way, he was very beholden to the people who had created the public image of Barack Obama. So I think it's an unfortunate situation. But that's my take in terms of leadership issues.
What about Roosevelt in that, by the way?
Well, Roosevelt is an interesting character. Of course, he is the only president to violate the two-term rule. And remember, the two-term rule was a custom. It was something that everybody agreed to, and it wasn't law. It is now law. The president cannot serve for more than 2 terms. And the problem with Roosevelt is that he is held on a very high pedestal, and it's undeserved. Basically, the 2 things you're going to hear about Roosevelt, particularly from my parents' generation, is he won World War II, after all. My God, he won World War II. Number 2, they're going to tell you he solved the Great Depression. The problem is they're both false. Number
Right.
1, we were never going to win. We were never going to lose World War II. If you look at it, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, suck us into it. We'd already begun our mechanization. Roosevelt, who had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy due to his vast wealth during the earlier years, during the Wilson administration, ordered the Pacific Fleet into Pearl Harbor, where they sat in a harbor with a tiny opening, basically created the situation for sitting ducks. Despite that, despite the incredible destruction of the Pacific Fleet, 6 months later, the American Navy wins the Battle of Midway. 6 months later. And when we came into Europe, both in World War I and World War II, it wasn't pretty, but we definitely accomplished a great deal. So the American military won the war and the American blood and guts, but it wasn't due to Roosevelt's unusually good leadership. And then the second part of that was the Great Depression. In tracking it, and I do include statistics in my book on each chapter, I talk about the national debt because it is a major concern of mine. And the national debt and the economic performance of the country was slowly improved early in Roosevelt's administration, normally does after a depression. And Roosevelt, because he implemented all of these socialist programs and massive government spending, actually defeated the process, the normal process of economic recovery. And instead, the United States was full on heading back into the Great Depression by 1939. Now, what happened in 1939 is the Brits and the French were kind of up against the wall with a well-prepared British-German operation. And so what happened, the United States actually started building armaments, tanks and guns and things for Britain and France to use in their defense. And so what happened is the economy spikes in 1939, 1940, not because Roosevelt was such a great economic planner, but because in a war, when you build things for the war, it spikes the economy. So I'm not a big fan of Roosevelt, and I consider him, I didn't give him the lowest rating in the book, but I think that he did the most damage to the American ideal and largely promoted what we still suffer from today, the big government model that we still have today.
Yeah. Now, before we move into part two, David, can I ask you to give me a couple of top rankings for 1, 2, or 3 in your mind? I mean, you obviously delved deep into these 17 presidents. Well, how did you feel at the end?
I gave Harry Truman the highest grade, again, not a high grade, but the highest grade of this crew, because, again, honesty, straightforwardness, largely, I think, tried to do the right thing. A big demerit to Truman was the Korean War, which we should have won. Instead, we basically lost it because we went to a tie. And I gave number 2 to Ronald Reagan, the great communicator. I think he played an instrumental part in the fall of the Soviet Union. Again, another flawed individual, flawed operation. Below that, several others, George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush, actually had a pretty good operation, not too many scandals during his administration. And I call him the unluckiest of the recent presidents because the economy was actually improving, but he suffered from a down economy at the time in November when the election took place, and Clinton was able to take advantage of that. And then another person that I have a lot of admiration for, although not a great president, was Calvin Coolidge. Quiet Cal. Calvin Coolidge gets points because he was the only president who reduced the national debt.
Brilliant.
Didn't just break even.
Yeah, I'm just going to squeeze one more question in on this part, by the way, David, and that's to ask you, are you planning an upgrade, a new part to include Trump?
Yes. Yeah, we're definitely going to add Trump. We're hoping our publisher is reasonably happy with us. Of course, I have other books and articles out, but I'm considered a first-time author in terms of a commercially distributed book. And so we're hoping we're going to get a second edition, and it'll definitely have a chapter on Trump. We'll also be revising a couple chapters because more stuff has come out about the 2 previous administrations.
Right. I think that's going to be one heck of a fascinating reprint, David.
It'll be fascinating.
Yes. Let's move to part 2. Thanks, David.
Okay.
So interesting and so very much of the moment. Now, you further enhanced your reputation by launching a podcast called Saving America. Now, the title seems designed to generate debate, not rowdy debates, I hope. Tell us about the concept, the content, and the call to action you hope to achieve from the podcast.
Well, as you know from my book, is I identified a number of areas that the United States needs to improve on. And I wanted to get my message out beyond the book to say, here are some things that we can do as Americans to improve our lot in life, to improve the future for our children and our grandchildren, and hopefully generations after that. And so we have a lot of problems today, unfortunately. And the irony of it is they're largely, even though a lot of leaders like to point at China and point at Russia under Putin and say, oh, we've got these big enemies, we've got these big problems. I think the biggest single problem is ourselves. And we've really let ourselves down. We have not lived up to the fabulous legacy that we inherited from, as many Americans call, the greatest generation, the generation of our parents who made it through World War II and brought the incredible economic and technological and medical developments that we've had since World War II. And so the idea of Saving America is a call to action, but an intelligent call to action to say, look, here are some things that we need to focus on, and there is a path forward that we can do. So that's the picture.
It's quite very interesting, that especially as this is the 400th year of the landing of the Mayflower, and that was the start of it all in a way, wasn't it? And it just wonders at this moment how progress is made. Do you progress and then slip back again, progress then slip back again? How do you think the life moves forward or not?
Well, what we'd like to avoid is the wonderful progress that was made in Europe. And what we saw in Europe, of course, with the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages and the Great Plague and the Black Plague and the things that hit, is that just as we saw in Europe, over 1,000, 2,000 year period, this tremendous growth and the literature and the advancements, people like Chaucer. And then you get to this period of great malaise, and then we have the Renaissance. And so I hope that we are in a short period of the Dark Ages, and that we will in turn have an American Renaissance here. And so that's, again, kind of the driving undercurrent to Saving America, is to say, hey, we're not gone yet. We can do better, but we need to step up.
Yeah. What do you think will be the rallying call for that? And obviously Black Lives Matters has come through very strongly. The Hispanic, I was in Los Angeles last night, and they're telling me about the 48% of the population there's Hispanic. So there's a real mix, but we don't seem to be getting to grips with it. We're trying in the UK, but we're failing getting to grips with this new society, bringing everybody together, all singing from as they say, the same hymn sheet. What will be the catalyst in your mind to achieving that, to Saving America?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm in one of the most diverse cities in America, in Houston, Texas. We have a predominant Hispanic population. We have a relatively small but active Black population. We have a rapidly growing Asian population, kind of comparable to the West Coast. And then we have a very vibrant white community. So we have quite an interesting mix. I think it is the future of America, where, and I teach at a university, by the way, that is Hispanic serving. And we actually, the largest population group within our university is Hispanic, and over 40% Hispanic students. And so we need to face a future which will be a very diverse future. And I think the diversity that we're seeing, the intermarriage between races, the growing together in neighborhoods where we don't have a black neighborhood next to a Hispanic neighborhood next to a white neighborhood. We have neighborhoods, and people, generally speaking, associate by socioeconomic class, not by color. And we have a growing middle class across the board. I present what is probably a very positive image, but you'll notice that Houston is one of the few large cities and a democratically controlled large city, democratically controlled county that has not had the violence that has been experienced in other major Democrat-controlled cities. So I think the diversity and the acceptance among people has been a very positive connection to get people together. And I hope that will continue and hopefully spread. I'm not a big fan of the BLM, Black Lives Matter, because of its leftist push. And I also don't like the false narrative and the violence behind it, although I think many people will say that it's more driven by Antifa and other terrorist groups that have kind of co-opted the meaning of the situation. And certainly we need to respect the police, but we also need to hold the police accountable in situations. So, but the irony of the situation is that when people talk about defunding the police and to change certain issues that are tied in with BLM, the problem with that is that if you go out and you talk to the people who live in low-income neighborhoods, who lives in low-income neighborhoods? Some white people do, but overwhelmingly Hispanic and Black populations live in low-income neighborhoods. You will find that the man on the street, the woman on the street says, I need to be safe in my home. I don't want to have gunfire flying through my house. I don't want to have my children killed. I don't want to have people dealing drugs on my corner. So ironically, they're not really helping the people that would be the apparent beneficiaries of doing a better job. And again, that's not an excuse for better police training. I'm just saying that we need police as to have a civilized society. And the most recognized leader of the Black community and for civil rights in general, not just for Black people, was Martin Luther King, who consistently argued for a peaceful push and was a very intelligent man from that standpoint, is really presented consistently, never anything other than peace is how we accomplish it. And of course, within the United Kingdom, Mahatma Gandhi accomplished by sitting there in the way a great deal more than a military force would have accomplished against Great Britain in India.
Yeah, I must admit before we move on to part 3, David, that we're finding it a bit perplexing in the UK. I mean that we've got enough perplexing going on here with COVID and Brexit, mind, but we find it very perplexing in about the US with Proud Boys, white supremacy, Black movement. It gets very difficult to understand, and some of the media we all watch, and I flick around different channels to try and get different media. But we find it quite perplexing. Do you think it's going to settle down soon?
Well, we've always had our share of crazies. Of course, America famously has the most liberal free speech policy in the world. I don't know of another country that has the free speech that we have. And in fact, as a college professor, one of the things I tell my students before spring break, because a lot of our students will go to other countries over spring break or the summertime, and I'll say, remember, keep your mouth shut. Don't fool with drugs, because you're not in the United States when you leave here, and you might say the wrong thing about the president of some country, and you may end up in a jail cell, and we're not going to be able to bail you out. So there's a little bit of that, but I think that we're going to move that a lot of what we see on television is not well. It is unfortunately, especially today, and I don't mean to sound like an extreme conservative, but the mainstream media has really sold out to the liberal left, and it's not reliable. And in fact, I work out at a big gym that has lots of TVs in front of the workout machines, which makes the workout a little faster, a little easier. And I am forced to watch some other channels that I don't like CNBC and CNN and so forth, that I consider totally without credibility. And I think if you're watching some of those channels, you're going to see a much different view of America than we see on a day-to-day basis. And it tends to emphasize some of these things. Certainly, like any rational American, I'm concerned about white supremacists, and usually we talk about the classic is, of course, the KKK. And I'm especially sensitive to that because I'm Jewish, half Catholic, and people forget that KKK was against Catholics, Jews, and blacks. That's what the 3Ks stood for, by the way. So I'm certainly got a little target on me. So a conservative does not mean someone who supports the idiotic notion of white supremacy. And I'm hopeful, though, that if we can get things settled down, that the spike in this white supremacy stuff will settle down if we can get some of the other things settled down. In other words, you get the fire started, it's hard to keep the people out of the bonfire, and that's what we're dealing with today. I'm hoping that's going to settle down.
Well, let's hope that it achieves, David. David, let's move to part 3. My intro gave me the pleasure of using Houston, we have a problem saying from Apollo 13, but let's find out from you what you think about how we can help solve the problems of the next 10, 20, even 100 years by becoming, changing, learning. How and what, David?
Well, I have the modest objective to make sure it's at least another 100 years of success. So just a modest objective, just, kind of the background behind Saving America. And one of the things is, if you think about the great, we mentioned Hadrian's Wall, and the Roman Empire was a phenomenal operation in the history of man, and its rough time frame is about 400 years. And I do talk about this in the introduction to my book, is that was something that will probably never be created. The British Empire, round numbers, was about 200 years. The American Empire is roughly 100 years, starting basically with the end of World War I, when we became the prominent military and economic force in the world. And my argument is that we seem to have lost our way at right about the 100-year point, and we will not be the dominant force for the next 100 years on leadership of civilization. And we may end up in another dark ages if we do not get our act together. And some of the basics that I'm arguing for is, number one, something that may seem counterintuitive. Number one, we need a reduction in the American government. We are bureaucratized to death. And that's why I cite Franklin Roosevelt's failure as a president, because he pushed America in the direction of big government. And America does best with less government, clearly. And there's some great quotes from our early leaders like Jefferson that clearly indicate you got too much government, you got problems.
Is that is that at federal level then, David?
No, I would argue that we've got too much government completely across the board, that we're so regulated here that we can't enforce all the regulations. Many small businesses have no clue as to how much regulation that they don't know about that they're supposed to follow, but it's gotten completely out of control. Number two, we have laid down in terms of education. Our public education system is in shambles. We've allowed the unions to take over. I come from a family where my mother's father and my mother's brother were union presidents. So I'm not saying this to be anti-union. I'm saying it as an observation. I don't think unions belong in the classroom. And I think that the influence of socialist thought, again, a completely failed operation. We see that today in Venezuela and Cuba. We don't need to go very far outside the the hemisphere to see massive failures due to socialism. But we've got to do a better job of doing the basic reading, writing, and arithmetic to make sure our kids can be competitive with the rest of the world. And I'm also, again, something that a lot of people don't associate with conservatives. I'm a huge fan of immigration. In fact, I would love, as a college president and an advisor, to bring in, if our president could give each college president, say, 100 passes to say, pick out your 100 best international students in your university and refer them to us. We'll take a look at them. And if they look good, they don't have a terrorist background or something, bang, they're going to be offered American citizenship. And we do face a challenge. Japan is an excellent example. Japan is actually depopulated. It's a very scary syndrome. I love Japan. I was there about a year ago, and what a phenomenal country. But they have had a very restrictive immigration policy and their own population, due to the relative wealth and education of their population, is not reproducing itself. They've got to do immigration. Actually talked with some leaders in Japan about that. Likewise, in the United States, we're not graduating enough technical graduates, not enough doctors, not enough nurses, not enough rocket scientists, as we say. And so I think if we liberalized our immigration policies, we could produce a tremendous opportunity. So that is where President Trump and I sharply disagree. And they're saying, well, because of COVID and the economic challenges, we need to crank down on immigration. There's limitations on H-1B visas. I'm not so sensitive to the H-1B visa as I am to the concept of let's open the doors intelligently. I agree with keeping the southern border closed, but that doesn't mean I'm against immigration. It means I'm against open immigration where people can wander in here without being checked out.
David, it's been inspiring meeting you, but you're not finished yet. There may be a lot of viewers at the moment are having a lot of confusion about what we can learn from the past and what we should do to go forward as global citizens. So just before you leave us, please give those viewers a final 3 pieces of call to action advice, what they should do now.
Okay. Number one is, the American media reports that President Trump is held in very low esteem throughout the world. And I just wonder how people throughout the rest of the world actually feel about President Trump, and why do they feel that way? So that would be my question number 1 for people to think about. Question number 2 would be one of the things is when we're picking leaders, we rarely get a choice of Mother Teresa combined with the communications of Ronald Reagan and the brilliance of some of our other great leaders. So I give people a thought question, something to ponder. And unfortunately, this is a choice that Americans face all too often. You have 2 choices of a leader. The first is a proven fraud, unethical, and perhaps dangerous. However, he or she can cause a robust economy and is nearly full employment. The second leader you get to pick from, you have to pick one of the 2, is a genuinely nice person, the classic nice guy or nice gal, attends church regularly, surrounded by his family. However, the second leader is clueless as to how to help the economy, and the stock market is going to crash, and we're going to have economic indicators below 0, and there will be record high unemployment. So with these 2 wonderful choices, which one are you going to choose?
Brilliant.
Then my question number 3, I'm sorry, go ahead, Malcolm.
You carry on, David.
And so question number 3 is, this is something that I actually think about. Actually, sometimes I'll be talking to people and I'll say, if I'm dictator for the day, this is what I'm going to do. And people, it's so funny because we have dictatorships all over the world, but people look at me like, you would be dictator where? So I don't know. Maybe there's a country in the world that would like to adopt me and have me come there and be dictator for the day. But in any event, if you were dictator for the day, what one thing about your government would you change? You only get to change one thing, but pick the one thing you would like to see your government do differently. So that's my 3 questions.
Brilliant, David, brilliant. In this extra special BV-TV web show, I've been talking to the man with the book of the moment. Behind me, you can see the details on the screen, Dr. David Schein. David, thanks for a truly stimulating show.
Thank you, Malcolm. It's been a wonderful experience, and I look forward to meeting you in person in the future.
I look forward to doing that too. Are you coming to UK or am I coming to Houston?
We can do both.
All right.